The rain started before dawn and never let up a steady cold curtain that turned the cemetery paths to slick ribbons, and I stood there with a black umbrella that wouldn't stop shivering in the wind. My mother's name, Elaine Bennett, caught a dull shine on the brass plate as the coffin lowered, and every spade of wet soil felt like a door locking from the inside. People whispered their condolences, then drifted away beneath their umbrellas, but the only voice I kept hearing was the one I didn't. My father's absent because he wasn't there. He was in Hawaii, smiling in a photo with a woman I'd never met, their champagne glasses bright against a sky I couldn't feel. The priest's words thinned into the rain like they were never meant for us. I whispered, "I'll take care of it, Mom," without knowing what it was. By the time the last car left, the wind had folded my umbrella backward and the cold had settled into my bones. I went home to a quiet apartment in a city that felt suddenly too large for one person to hold. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever stood alone at a graveside and promised yourself you'd keep going. My name is Nora Bennett, and I've always been the steady one, the person who keeps a calendar on the wall and a spare flashlight in the drawer, the daughter who sends birthday cards on time and brings soup when someone catches a winter cold. I grew up in a modest craftsman on the east side of Portland, the kind of house with creaky floorboards and a front porch that sagged in the middle, where my mother painted with the windows open and the smell of linseed oil clung to the curtains. She taught me how to mix colors and how to be kind, the way you wash a brush until the water runs clear and you hand it back better than you found it. My father built his name in real estate, always in a pressed shirt, always on a call, and when he did look up, it was to teach me that results matter, not reasons. My life settled somewhere between them, the art shows and secondhand frames with my mother, the sharp edges of business dinners with my father, me learning to breathe differently in each room. When I moved into my own place, a one-bedroom with a narrow view of the Willamette River and a balcony that could barely fit 2 chairs, I brought her old studio stool and set it in the corner near my drafting table. I work as a freelance designer, the kind of jobs that arrive at midnight and need to be polished by morning logos and layouts. Simple things that pay a steady rent if you keep your promises. My clients are roofers, florists, small cafes, the kind of businesses where you meet the owner and shake hands over a laminated menu. On days when deadlines stacked, I'd call my mother and she'd remind me to eat something warm, and when I hung up, I'd feel like the person she thought I was. My father's world felt farther away, glass towers, new developments, a pace that thrummed with money. When he did call, his voice carried that background hum, and I measured my answers so they sounded like progress. I believed our balance would hold Sunday phone calls with my mother, holiday dinners that appeared like clockwork, the confident click of my father's car door before he handed me an envelope with something practical inside. But the year turned tight and odd in small ways I couldn't name. My mother missed a gallery brunch because she wasn't feeling up to it, and when I offered to drive her, she said she'd already told the curator she'd pass. My father canceled lunch twice with a text that felt copied from some distant calendar, and when he finally showed, he checked his watch as often as he looked at me. I told myself it was nothing, just the season, just the way the light goes thinner in late fall and people hurry. The day the hospital called, I picked up because the number didn't look like a sales pitch, and the voice on the other end trembled, as if the words had weight, as if saying them would change the shape of the room I stood in. "I'm so sorry," she said, and the apology landed before the words that followed. And then I was looking at my own reflection in the window, and not recognizing the expression on my face. My mother had no history of heart trouble. She walked every morning, she laughed easily, she made tea, and told me which blends were best when the rain came hard. I listened to the explanation about sudden cardiac arrest as if it were a story for someone else, a scripted line that belonged in a show I didn't watch. When I called my father, the pause before he spoke was longer than his sympathy, and I hung up and leaned my head against the wall until the hallway stopped swaying. Grief took hours and folded them into a single, long afternoon. I answered texts I can't remember writing, and picked out a black dress by touching the fabric instead of seeing it. and I walked through dark rooms that belonged to the same day because the weather wouldn't change. When the funeral ended and the rain kept its rhythm, I searched my father's public posts and found the picture that did not belong to us, bare feet in sand, a pale stem of glass, a woman laughing next to him like an advertisement for forgetting. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet, the apartment smaller than it had ever felt, and the city's lights turning into a string of faraway signals I couldn't translate. It would have been easier to go to bed and let the dark pull the rest of the day under, but sleep wouldn't come, and the room kept breathing with that thin, hollow sound a building makes when the wind threads every seam. What I remember next is the simple buzz of my phone and the way the screen lit my hands and how the name at the top made me sit up. Mom. That contact I hadn't been able to delete, the one I kept because it felt like keeping a door cracked. The message was short, and it didn't try to convince me with explanations, just 8 words that rearranged the air in my lungs. I'm not dead. Come to the cemetery now. I stared at it long enough for the light to dim and then brighten again, and the rain pressed harder against the glass, and somewhere beneath the sound of it, a choice gathered. I reached for my keys, and the quiet moved aside. The drive to the cemetery felt endless, the kind of dark where the headlights barely made a dent. The rain hadn't eased since morning, and each drop hit the windshield like it was trying to keep me from seeing what waited ahead. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles hurt the message still glowing on my phone screen beside me. I told myself it was a mistake that someone had found my mother's phone and thought this was funny, but I couldn't make myself believe it. My mother didn't joke that way. The road curved sharply, the trees pressing in close, and when the iron gates appeared through the fog, I knew I was going in whether it made sense or not. The cemetery lights flickered weakly, half swallowed by mist. I parked near the old willow trees, my heart hammering so hard it blurred the sound of the rain. Mom. I called out, my voice thin against the wind. There was nothing at first, only the metallic hiss of water sliding off stone. Then, through the fog, a shape moved near the far row of graves, a woman small wrapped in a soaked coat. I froze. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I lifted it. Her face came into focus, pale and familiar hair plastered to her cheeks, those same hazel eyes I'd seen every day of my childhood. "Nora," she whispered. It was her voice. My knees went weak. The light slipped from my hand and landed in the mud. I took a step, then another, until she was close enough for me to touch. "Mom, how—" My voice cracked. "You're supposed to be gone." Her hands found mine, ice cold, but real. "I'm here, sweetheart, but you can't tell anyone. Not yet." We stood there in the downpour, 2 people who shouldn't have been in the same world anymore. She pulled me into her arms, her breath shaking against my shoulder. "We have to leave," she whispered. "Someone could see us." We hurried toward a small silver sedan parked under the trees. Inside, the heater coughed to life, fogging the windows. I couldn't stop staring at her face, the bruised circles under her eyes, the way her hair clung to her skin. "Mom, everyone saw you," I said softly. "They buried you." She looked at me for a long time, then turned the key in the ignition without answering. "It's not safe to talk here." When we finally pulled onto the main road, the rain slowed to a steady hiss, like the world itself was catching its breath. "You have to tell me what's happening," I said. "Why would you send that message? Why make me think you were?" she interrupted gently. "It wasn't a message, Nora. It was the only way to bring you to me before he does." I stared at her. "Who?" Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Your father." My stomach turned cold. "Dad Douglas tried to kill me," she said, the words landing slow and sure like stones dropped into water. "He's not the man you think he is." I waited for her to explain for a story that made sense, but she just kept driving until we reached a quiet side road. She parked beside an abandoned barn and turned to me. "For months, he's been pressuring me to sign everything over the studio, the properties the company shares in my name. When I refused, he said he'd find a way to make me disappear." I shook my head. "That's impossible. He's cold, yes, but murder—" Her voice broke. "He's a businessman. He only sees profit and loss, and I stopped being profitable. The night she died, she said she'd been painting in her studio when the pain started sharp suffocating, spreading through her chest. Their housekeeper panicked and called an ambulance. At the hospital, Douglas showed up not with flowers or comfort, but with documents. He wanted her signature before she was too weak to resist. When she refused, he left her there without looking back. That should have been the end, but one person noticed the bruises already fading on her arm. Miriam Cole, a nurse who had once been one of her art students. Miriam recognized the fear and refused to let it end that way. She switched the medical records, replaced the final report with one that read cardiac arrest, and arranged for a closed casket. They used a mannequin, my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone believed it was me. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to hold the world steady. You faked your death, I whispered. It was the only way to stay alive, she said. Lightning flashed outside, and for a second her face lit up pale and fierce. I thought if he believed I was gone, he'd stop. But when I saw that post New Beginnings, I knew he wouldn't. He's celebrating Nora, and if he learns I'm alive, he'll come for you next. The car went silent, except for the rain ticking against the roof. I could still picture my father's smile in that beach photo, the same smile he wore at charity dinners and business galas, polished and hollow. Then we stop him first, I said. She shook her head. You don't know what he's capable of. I do, I answered quietly. You taught me how to see what's real. She looked at me, then really looked, as if seeing someone she hadn't noticed before. After a long pause, she nodded. If we do this, we do it smart. No mistakes. By the time we reached the edge of town, the rain had thinned to a mist. She drove us to a small cabin tucked behind rows of pine trees, one of her friend's rental properties, she explained, a place no one would think to check. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and cedar. There was one lamp, a cot, and a folded blanket. You can't tell anyone, she said, her voice firm. Not the police, not your friends. The fewer people who know, the safer you are. I nodded because the words made sense, even though nothing else did. Miriam checks in every few hours, she added. She brings food and medication. I stay here quiet and wait. I wanted to tell her I couldn't just wait, that sitting still would drive me insane, but her face stopped me. She looked fragile under that single lamp, like a painting left out in the rain too long. We sat at the small table, hands wrapped around mugs of tea that had gone cold. Mom, I said after a while, how long have you known? Her eyes drifted to the window. Long enough to wish I'd left sooner. Morning came gray and thin, filtering through the curtains. I drove back to the city with her warning echoing in my head. My father called just after 8, his voice unusually bright. Nora, sweetheart, I'm finalizing your mother's estate today. I'll need your signature on a few documents. Nothing complicated. My pulse quickened. What kind of documents? Transfer forms. Paperwork. Come by the house tonight. The calm in his voice was worse than any anger. Sure, I said. I'll be there. When the call ended, I texted my mother. He's making his move. Her reply came fast. Let him think he's winning. The words sat on my screen like a plan written in invisible ink. That night, the mansion looked colder than I remembered, too perfect, too silent. The marble floors gleamed under chandelier light, and the air smelled of polished wood and old secrets. My father waited in his office, the same smile painted neatly in place. You look tired, he said, pouring himself a drink. Losing sleep over old things? I met his eyes. Over people who are supposed to be dead. His hand paused midair, then he set the glass down. Careful with your words. He slid a folder across the desk. These will settle everything. Sign and you'll have no worries. I flipped through the pages and my breath caught. My mother's signature was already there, smooth, practiced, perfect. I looked up slowly. You forged her signature. He gave a short laugh. I don't forge. Your mother signed before she passed. I stood. That's funny. She told me she'd rather burn everything than hand it to you. The smile vanished. Sit down. I didn't. I'm not signing. His voice softened the way it used to before he scolded me as a child. Nora, don't make me force you. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from how calm he sounded. You already killed her once, I said. You won't do it again. His eyes snapped open wide. What did you say? You heard me. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You've been talking to someone. I said nothing. He leaned forward, breathing hard, then finally pointed toward the door. "Get out!" I turned to leave, and in the reflection of the glass cabinet behind his desk, I saw a small wall safe, partly hidden by a photo of our family. The sight anchored itself in my mind. "Sure, Dad," I said quietly. "I'll go." Outside, the air smelled of rain and gasoline. My heart pounded as I started the car. The mansion lights blurred behind me, and the road ahead shimmered with puddles. I didn't know what I'd just stepped into, but I knew I couldn't turn back. When I reached the city, I parked by the river and sat in the dark, my phone buzzing against the console. It was my mother. "Be careful," the message read. "He's dangerous when cornered." I typed back, "I saw a safe. I think the proof is inside." Her reply came almost instantly, "Then wait for the right moment." But waiting wasn't something I could do anymore. That was the night everything began to shift, the moment the quiet daughter who followed every rule decided to find the truth herself. I didn't sleep at all that night. The wind outside moved through the trees like a warning, and every creak in the apartment reminded me of what I'd seen in my father's office. The folder, the forged signature, the safe hidden behind the family photo. By sunrise, I'd already made up my mind. If the proof was inside that safe, I was going to find it. The streets were quiet when I parked down the block from the mansion. I still had the spare key from when I was younger, the one my mother never asked for back. The house looked different in the early light, cold, hollow, stripped of the life she'd once filled it with. I slipped inside through the kitchen door, moving carefully over marble that echoed every step. His office door was closed. I waited, listening for any sound upstairs. Nothing but silence. He was gone, just like I hoped. I crossed to the desk, the air thick with the faint smell of cigar smoke. The safe was just where I remembered, partly hidden behind the framed photo of the three of us taken years ago at Cannon Beach. My fingers shook as I turned the dial, trying combinations that came to mind. Birthdays, addresses, anything familiar. On the third try, I heard the soft click. I almost didn't believe it. I pulled the door open, and there it was, stacks of folders, rolled bank statements, passports with unfamiliar names, and a flash drive in a small metal case. I copied everything to my own drive, then took a quick set of photos with my phone. I closed the safe, locked it again, and wiped the desk clean of fingerprints. When I slipped back out into the rain, my heart was racing so fast I could hardly breathe. I sat in my car for a long time, just staring at the flash drive in my hand. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the whole story of who my father really was. I texted my mother. "Got it." Her reply came instantly. "Good. Now, Nora, be careful. He'll know." I didn't even have time to process it before my phone buzzed again. The number wasn't saved, but I didn't need to see a name. "You think I wouldn't notice, Nora?" My blood went cold. The message burned on the screen like a threat carved into glass. My hands trembled as I looked around the empty street, the rain pooling around the tires. The phone rang a moment later. I answered without thinking. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word landed like a warning. "You were always clever," he said, "but you forget who taught you how to lie." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "You don't scare me." He chuckled softly. "Don't I?" "Come home, Nora. Let's talk, or I'll make sure you regret stealing from me." I could hear the low hum of the car engine on his end, the faint echo of windshield wipers. "Stealing," I said. "You mean evidence." The silence that followed was worse than the threat. When he finally spoke again, his voice dropped lower. "If you're smart, you'll destroy it. Otherwise, maybe another funeral will be needed." Then the line went dead. I sat frozen, staring at the rain blurring the windshield. For a moment, I thought I could still hear his voice in the engine's idle, the same tone he used when I was little and caught doing something wrong. I pressed my palms against the steering wheel and forced myself to breathe. This wasn't the time to break down. I started the car and drove straight to the cabin. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She looked smaller somehow, wrapped in a sweater, her hair still damp from a recent shower. "Nora, what happened?" she asked. I dropped the flash drive onto the table. "He knows. He sent me a message. He called." Her eyes widened. "What did he say?" "That I'd regret it," I said quietly. "That maybe there'd be another funeral." She sank into the nearest chair, her hand covering her mouth. I should have never let you go back there. I sat across from her. Mom, we can't run forever. We have enough here to expose him. I opened my laptop and showed her the files: offshore transfers, false property deeds, and an audio file labeled Agreement 3. When I pressed play, my father's voice filled the room. It's simple, he was saying. We dissolve the art trust, move the funds under my name. She'll sign one way or another. My mother closed her eyes. That's him. That's all they need. We called Miriam first. She listened quietly as my mother explained everything. You can't go to the police yet, Miriam said. He has contacts everywhere. You need to go federal. She promised to connect us with someone she trusted, a lawyer she once met through a patient. Her name was Harper Lane, a defense attorney with a reputation for going up against corporate fraud. By that afternoon, Harper had arranged a private meeting in a small office outside the city. When we arrived, Harper stood from behind her desk, her tone calm and direct. I read the summary Miriam sent me. What you're describing is serious financial crimes, coercion, maybe even attempted homicide. If the documents check out, the Bureau will want them immediately. I handed her the flash drive. Everything's on there. She plugged it in, scrolling through the files, her expression tightening. These are damning. We'll prepare a packet for the FBI. Once it's in their hands, you'll both need protection. That night, we stayed in a small motel halfway between Portland and the coast. My mother couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the lamp turned low, staring at the rain sliding down the glass. He's not going to stop, she said. He'll come here if he has to. I crossed the room and sat beside her. Then let him. This time we're ready. 2 days later, we sent everything anonymously through Harper's encrypted portal documents, recordings, account numbers. She promised to notify us when the Bureau acknowledged receipt. For the first time in weeks, I thought maybe we could breathe. We didn't know he was already watching. It was just after midnight when headlights flared across the cabin wall. My mother froze. "Who is that?" she whispered. I checked the window. A black sedan sat idling in the drive. A figure stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, moving fast through the rain. "It's him," she said, her voice breaking. Douglas. The knock that followed shook the frame. Nora. His voice boomed through the door. "Open up. Let's end this ridiculous game." I could see the handle trembling as he pounded again. My mother grabbed my arm. "Don't. He's dangerous." But I was done hiding. I unlocked the latch and pulled the door open. He stood there, drenched, his expensive suit clinging to him, hair plastered against his forehead. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression hollow with fury. "Where is she?" he demanded. I stepped into the doorway. "Where's who? Dad? The wife you buried?" His jaw clenched. "You don't understand what she did to me." I said, "She loved you." His face twisted. "She ruined me." He pushed past me, shouting her name. "Elaine." My mother stepped out of the hallway. "I'm right here." The look on his face when he saw her was something I'll never forget. For a second, all the noise stopped, the rain, the thunder, everything. He went pale, his mouth open like the air had left him. "No," he whispered. "No, this isn't possible. You're dead." My mother's voice was steady, almost calm. "You tried to make me dead." He laughed, then a broken sound. "You think you can take everything from me. The company, my name. You're nothing without me." I stepped between them. "That's where you're wrong." In the distance, sirens began to rise, a low wail cutting through the storm. His head snapped toward the window. "What did you do?" he shouted. My mother's eyes didn't leave his. "What you taught us," she said quietly. "Cover your tracks. Unfortunately, you left too many." The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed through the rain. He spun toward me, his voice cracking. "Nora, tell them they're wrong. Tell them I didn't." I shook my head. "You buried the wrong woman." Agents burst through the door, shouting commands. Douglas stumbled backward. His hands raised the fury draining from his face as they cuffed him. The rain roared louder, drowning out his protests as they led him away. When the door finally shut behind them, the cabin went silent, except for the soft ticking of rain from the roof. My mother leaned against the wall, her breath shaking. "It's over," she said. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her heartbeat steady against mine. "No," I whispered. "It's just beginning." Outside, dawn broke over the trees, a thin line of light spreading through the mist. For the first time since that text message appeared on my phone, the rain had finally stopped. The news broke before sunrise. My phone lit up with alerts, each headline carrying my father's name, like a warning real estate magnate Douglas Bennett under investigation for fraud and attempted homicide. By the time I turned on the television, every local station was already outside the courthouse, reporters shouting over the sound of wind and rain. I sat beside my mother in the small motel room, the curtains drawn, the faint hum of traffic filling the silence. She looked fragile, but composed hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. On the screen, they showed footage of him being led into a federal vehicle, his wrists in cuffs, his face pale under the flashing lights. "He's finally where he belongs," I said quietly. My mother didn't answer. Her eyes stayed on the screen, unreadable, as if part of her was still waiting for the sound of his voice. The days that followed blurred together calls from lawyers, interviews with investigators, and signed affidavits that felt like closing chapters we never meant to write. Harper stayed in touch daily, patient and firm. She guided us through every document, making sure each fact matched the evidence. "They'll want to move fast," she said during one call. "His network runs deep, and the Bureau won't take chances." I thanked her, but gratitude felt too small a word for what she'd done. Without her, none of this would have reached daylight. By the end of the week, the motel began to feel less like hiding and more like limbo. My mother slept in short stretches, waking from dreams that left her trembling. I kept the television off most nights, though. Sometimes the flicker of breaking news filled the silence, whether I wanted it or not. Each time his image appeared, the same confident smile he used at fundraisers and real estate expos, I felt the strange ache of familiarity twist into something colder. The world was finally seeing the man he really was, but for me, that truth had already arrived too late. When the arraignment came, Harper arranged for us to attend through a secured line instead of in person. I watched the live feed on a government-provided screen, my reflection faint in the glass. My father stood in a gray suit that hung looser than before his hair, uncombed, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't name. The judge read the charges: fraud, money laundering, attempted murder, and asked if he understood. He nodded once, expression blank. My mother's hand found mine. "He doesn't look real anymore," she whispered. I glanced at her. He never was. The hearing ended quickly. Bail was denied. The agents escorted him out, and the camera cut back to a grainy image of the courthouse steps. I turned the screen off and exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. 3 months passed before the trial began. We moved to a quiet apartment near the Oregon coast, away from reporters and curious neighbors. The ocean was gray that time of year, its rhythm steady and forgiving. My mother spent most days painting again, though her strokes were different now, lighter, freer. The first piece she finished was a portrait of the sea under a clearing sky. When I asked what she'd call it, she said, "Morning after the storm." The courthouse in Portland was crowded when we arrived for the first day. Reporters lined the steps, microphones raised like weapons. Harper guided us through a side entrance, calm and steady as always. "Just speak the truth," she said to my mother. "Nothing else matters now." Inside, the air buzzed with low murmurs. Shareholders, former associates, people who once toasted to my father's success, all of them waiting for the spectacle. He sat at the defense table, shoulders squared, a thin layer of arrogance still clinging to him. He didn't look at us until my mother took the stand. The room fell quiet as she swore the oath, her voice clear, though her hands trembled slightly. "I faked my death," she began. "Not out of revenge, out of survival." The words carried across the chamber like a slow echo. I watched the jurors lean forward, their pens stilling. She described the threats, the pressure to sign over her assets, and the night he said she'd be worth more dead than alive. She didn't cry, not once. She simply told the truth line by line until the silence in the room felt almost reverent. When it was my turn, my legs felt heavy walking to the stand. He watched me, and for a moment, I saw something familiar in his eyes, the faint trace of the father who once taught me how to ride a bike, who used to say that courage was just fear that decided to stand still. I took a breath and spoke. "He taught me how to be brave," I said quietly, "but I don't think he expected I'd use that bravery against him." His eyes flickered the first crack in that cold composure. Harper presented the evidence next: the offshore transfers, the falsified contracts, the audio recordings. Every click of the projector sounded like another wall collapsing. When the final piece played, his voice saying, "She'll sign one way or another," the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. My mother looked down at her folded hands. He just closed his eyes, the fight draining out of him. The deliberation took less than a day. When the jury returned, the room went still. The foreperson stood and read the verdict: guilty on all counts. My father didn't speak. He didn't shout or plead. He just lowered his head. Shoulders slumped, the silence heavier than any outburst. The judge's voice was steady as she delivered the sentence: 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. The gavel struck, once the sound echoing like distant thunder. My mother exhaled, her hands shaking in mine. I didn't realize I was crying until she reached over and brushed the tears away. As the marshals led him out, he glanced back for just a moment. His eyes softened, not with remorse, but something closer to recognition. It lasted only a second before he turned away. Outside, reporters crowded the steps again, flashes bursting like lightning. A woman from the local news shouted, "Mrs. Bennett, how does it feel to bring down one of Portland's most powerful men?" My mother paused, her expression calm but tired. "It doesn't feel like victory," she said. "It feels like freedom." That evening, the story ran on every channel. They called her the woman who returned from the dead. But sitting beside her in that small apartment, watching the last light fade across the ocean, I knew better. She hadn't come back from the dead. She had simply refused to stay buried. In the weeks that followed, the noise faded. Reporters moved on to new scandals, and the world quieted around us. My mother began teaching again, offering free art classes at a community center near the coast. I opened a design studio in town, small but steady, and named it Elaine and Nora Designs. It wasn't just a business. It was proof that we could build something honest from everything he'd tried to destroy. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the water, my mother stood at the edge of the shore, paintbrush in hand, the wind tugging gently at her hair. I joined her, watching the tide crawl up the sand. "What are you painting?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Freedom." We stayed there until the light disappeared and the sky turned the color of deep slate. The past had left its marks, but for the first time it didn't define us. The storm was over, and the quiet that followed was something close to peace. Still, one question lingered: the text message that started it all. One night, while we sat on the porch listening to the waves, I finally asked Mom who sent it, the message that said, "You weren't dead." She turned to me puzzled. "I didn't," she said. "My phone was off that night." Miriam took it. The air seemed to pause between us. I frowned. "Then who—" She looked out toward the dark horizon, the wind brushing against her face. Maybe something or someone didn't want the truth buried forever. Her hand found mine, warm and steady. "Whatever it was," she said softly, "it saved us." The sound of the sea filled the silence, steady and endless. I thought about the rain that had followed us for weeks, and how it finally stopped the morning he was arrested. Maybe that was all the message ever meant, a sign that even the worst storms end. We just have to keep standing long enough to see the sun again. The weeks after the verdict passed in quiet waves. The cameras left the headlines faded, and for the first time in months, my mother and I could breathe without glancing over our shoulders. We moved into a small white cottage near the Oregon coast, a place with a front porch that creaked when you stepped on the third board, and a garden that smelled of rosemary after the rain. It wasn't much compared to the marble halls my father once called home, but it was ours, and it was enough. Each morning, I'd hear the soft scratch of my mother's paintbrush from the porch. She started teaching again, offering lessons to local kids who couldn't afford private classes. The laughter that floated from those sessions filled the space that silence used to claim. I spent my days setting up our new studio, Elaine and Nora Designs, in a narrow building off Main Street. The sign out front was simple, hand-painted, just like the kind she used to make for her exhibitions. We worked side by side most evenings, her with her easel, me at my desk, the air between us lighter than it had ever been. For months we kept to ourselves. The world moved on, but every so often, a letter or email would find its way through people who'd read about her in the news, survivors of their own hidden battles, strangers who saw strength in her story. She never replied, but she kept them all in a small wooden box by the window. Reminders, she said one day, that truth always travels farther than lies. I watched her fold the latest letter and tuck it away, her hands steady, her eyes softer than they used to be. When winter came, the coastline turned silver and cold. Our days fell into a rhythm: coffee before sunrise, her teaching in the mornings, my design work in the afternoons, and quiet walks along the water in the evenings. We rarely spoke about my father, though his shadow lingered in small ways: a news brief about the trial's appeals, a letter from the Department of Justice confirming his sentence. I'd catch my mother reading them once, then folding them neatly and placing them at the bottom of a drawer. She never tore them up, never raged. She simply let them rest, as if acknowledging the past without feeding it. One afternoon in February, Harper called. Her voice carried a warmth I hadn't realized I missed. "How are you both holding up?" she asked. "Better," I said, glancing at my mother painting by the window. "Calmer." Harper hesitated. "There's something you should know. The Bureau closed the investigation this morning. All assets have been liquidated. Every stolen dollar he hid has been recovered." My chest loosened. "So it's done?" "It's done," she said. "Legally and finally." After I hung up, I told my mother. She didn't say a word at first, just dipped her brush into a jar of blue paint and set it down. "Then it's really over," she murmured. The sea wind came through the open window, carrying the faint smell of salt and pine. "No," I said quietly. "It's finally beginning." That evening we drove to the beach. The tide was low, the horizon glowing faintly pink as the sun sank into the water. My mother carried a small jar filled with gray ash, the remains of old sketches and papers she'd burned earlier that morning. She walked to the edge of the waves, opened the lid, and let the wind carry them out to sea. "For closure," she said. I nodded, standing beside her. The tide washed over our shoes, cold and steady. For a long time, neither of us spoke. As spring approached, our little studio began to thrive. Local galleries requested her paintings and small businesses hired me for branding and design. We didn't advertise much. Word of mouth was enough. People came for work, but many stayed to talk, drawn by something unspoken in our calm. My mother said it was because art carried truth in color, and people could feel when something was real. I think she was right. Then one morning in May, a thick envelope arrived addressed to her. It bore the seal of a production company from Los Angeles. They wanted to buy the rights to her story, a documentary, a book interviews. I watched her turn the envelope in her hands, her expression unreadable. "They'll pay well," I said. She smiled faintly and set it aside. "I've already lived it," she said. "I don't need to sell it again." She reached for her brush and added another stroke of gold to the canvas drying in the sunlight. That was the end of the conversation. Our life settled into something simple, almost peaceful. We rebuilt what was left of the past piece by piece. But some nights when the ocean wind grew colder and the house went quiet, I'd find her standing by the window staring at nothing. I never asked what she was thinking. Maybe she was remembering the years before everything fell apart, or maybe she was finally letting them go. In June, the city invited her to exhibit her work at the annual Coastal Art Fair. It was her first public event since everything had happened. I helped her set up the booth, 8 paintings, each one telling a story in color. The last piece she hung was small, a quiet scene of a storm clearing over the sea. She titled it, "The Long Night." When the crowd began to gather, I stepped back and watched her greet people, laughing softly, her voice steady and kind. Not a single person recognized her from the headlines. They just saw her for who she was, a woman who painted beauty back into her own life. By the time the sun dipped behind the cliffs, nearly every painting had sold. We packed up slowly, the smell of salt air and canvas thick around us. As we carried the last box to the truck, she looked at me with a tired smile. "Do you realize," she said, "this is the first time I've felt at home in years?" I nodded. That's because you built it yourself. A week later, I got a letter from the prison system. It wasn't unexpected, but it still made my hands tremble. My father had sent it through his attorney, 4 pages of apology and explanation written in the same sharp handwriting I remembered from his business notes. He said he was sorry that the money, the pressure, the lies had consumed him. He wrote that he'd seen my mother's testimony replayed in the news and couldn't sleep afterward. I read it once then again, but no part of me believed he was looking for forgiveness. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same wooden box where my mother kept her letters. When she found it later that evening, she only said, "We'll let time answer him." Summer came with long golden evenings and the smell of the ocean warming in the sun. The garden grew wild with daisies and mint, and the studio windows stayed open late into the night. Sometimes we'd sit outside after dinner, the sound of waves mixing with the chirping of crickets. She'd talk about teaching a summer class at the community center, and I'd tell her about new clients asking for designs with her artwork. Life had finally softened its edges. Still on quiet nights when the wind came in just right, I'd think back to that first message on my phone, the one that brought me to the cemetery, the one that changed everything. I never found out who sent it. My mother still believed it was fate, a small mercy from the universe, that refused to let the truth stay buried. One evening in late July, as the tide rolled in, I stood outside our cottage, watching the moon rise over the water. The air was warm, and for the first time in years the sound of the waves didn't feel lonely. Inside I could hear her humming a soft, familiar tune she used to sing while painting. The light from her studio window spilled across the sand, pale and steady. I realized then that we'd come full circle, not to where we started, but to where we were meant to end up. I went inside, closed the door behind me, and let the quiet settle. Whatever came next, I knew we'd face it together. The storm was long over, but its memory had taught us how to stand when the wind returned. And in that small cottage by the sea, surrounded by the life we rebuilt, we finally had peace. Summer faded slowly that year. The days, stretching longer than they should have, like time itself, was trying to make up for what we'd lost. The cottage had settled into a rhythm, quiet mornings, soft music from my mother's studio, and evenings filled with the smell of salt and fresh paint. By August, our studio had become more than just a workspace. It was a gathering place. Locals would stop by for design consultations, art classes, or simply to talk. People trusted the calm they found there, the same calm my mother and I had spent years trying to rebuild. One afternoon, a man came into the shop holding a newspaper. He pointed to a small article halfway down the page. "Did you see this?" he asked. I took it from him. It was a brief notice Douglas Bennett, former Portland developer, transferred to state medical custody following a health evaluation. My stomach tightened. I hadn't heard his name in months. I thanked the man, folded the paper, and slid it into the drawer beside my desk. When my mother saw it later, she didn't ask to read it. She just closed the drawer quietly and said, "Some things belong behind closed doors." Still something about that short headline lingered. That night, while the ocean wind rattled the window panes, I sat on the porch with my laptop and searched for details. There was almost nothing, just one line in a legal bulletin confirming his transfer from federal prison to a medical unit due to declining health and psychiatric instability. I closed the screen and stared out toward the dark sea. I wanted to feel peace, but unease crept in instead. The next morning I found my mother already awake, painting by the kitchen window. The canvas showed a field of tall yellow grass, each blade bent in one direction like they were bowing to the wind. "You're up early," I said. "Couldn't sleep," she replied without turning around. Her brush moved in small, precise strokes. "You read about it, didn't you?" I hesitated. "Yes." She nodded once. "Then let's not give it power. He's behind walls, Nora. That's enough." I wanted to believe that, but something in her voice told me she wasn't convinced either. A few weeks passed before the first letter came. It arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address. My name was written in the same sharp handwriting I'd hoped never to see again. Inside was a single page. "You think you know what happened," it read. "But there are things neither of you understand. The truth isn't as clean as you think." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. My hand shook as I folded it back into the envelope. When I showed it to my mother, she read it once, her face unreadable, then tore it in half. "He's playing a game," she said. "Don't give him what he wants." We changed our mailing address that week, but the letters kept coming, different handwriting, different paper, but always the same tone. Some hinted at regret, others at blame. Harper called the bureau on our behalf, and they confirmed what we already knew: prisoners could send mail through approved channels, but not all of it was intercepted before delivery. "It's harassment," she said firmly. "I'll make sure it stops." It did for a while. Then one afternoon in October, Miriam stopped by with a basket of apples from her orchard. She'd been a constant in our lives since the beginning, steady, quiet, loyal. We sat at the kitchen table peeling fruit for pies when she looked up suddenly. "You've heard, haven't you?" she asked softly. My mother paused mid-motion. "He's dead." The room went still. The only sound was the soft scrape of the peeler against apple skin. Miriam reached across the table and took her hand. "It happened last week. Heart failure in custody. They'll contact you for formal notification." The letter came 3 days later. It was brief, an official notice from the Bureau of Prisons. My father had died in his sleep during the night of October 9th. No request for next of kin, no estate to claim, just a line confirming cremation had been completed. I set it down on the table, unsure what to feel. My mother stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "After all that noise, he just disappeared quietly." That evening we walked along the shoreline as the tide pulled in. The sky was low and gray, the kind that promised rain, but never followed through. "Do you want to hold a service?" I asked. She shook her head. "There's nothing to bury Nora. He was gone long before this." Her voice held no anger, only exhaustion. We stood in silence, watching the waves erase our footprints as fast as we made them. For a few days the house stayed unnaturally quiet. She painted less, and the music from her studio stopped altogether. One night I found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in her old shawl, staring at the sea. "I keep thinking about the early years," she said softly. "Before the money, before the pressure. He used to make me laugh." I sat beside her, unsure what to say. "I don't miss the man he became," she continued, "but I mourn the man he might have stayed if he'd chosen differently." She turned toward me, her eyes gentle but firm. "Promise me you'll never let anger build a home inside you, Nora. It takes everything you love to keep it standing." After that night, something in her lightened. She started painting again, not from memory, but from imagination fields, rivers, skies that never existed except in her mind. Her students noticed, too. "She's painting joy again," one of them told me with a smile. I nodded, watching through the studio window as my mother laughed with the children, her hands moving freely across the canvas. It felt like life was returning in small, steady pieces. One afternoon in November, Harper visited us for the first time since the trial. She looked around the studio impressed. "You've built something beautiful here," she said. My mother smiled. "We had to start over. It was the only way forward." Harper placed a small folder on the table. "These are the final legal documents, closure of his estate, all remaining accounts transferred to restitution. It's done officially this time." She paused. "There's one more thing. He left a statement in his will. It's brief." She handed my mother a single page. My mother read silently, her expression calm. Then she folded it and slid it into a drawer. "No more ghosts," she said quietly. That night as we closed the shop, I found myself standing outside the window watching her lock the door. The light behind her caught on the silver streaks in her hair, and I realized how far we'd come. The woman who once hid in shadows now walked through the world without flinching. When we got home, she poured 2 cups of tea and set them on the table. "Do you feel lighter?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Not lighter," she said, "just clearer. Grief doesn't vanish when the person is gone, it just changes shape. You stop carrying them in pain and start carrying them in memory." Outside, the ocean shimmered under the moonlight, calm and endless. For the first time in years, there was no fear attached to the darkness beyond the waves, only quiet acceptance. I realized that closure isn't a moment. It's a slow unfolding like dawn after a long night. Before we went to bed, she looked at me and said, "Nora, whatever happens next, promise me you'll keep living forward. Don't build your life around what's already ended." I nodded, and she smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft light from the kitchen. As I turned off the lamp, I caught one last glimpse of her standing by the window, gazing toward the horizon. The sea wind lifted the curtains slightly, carrying in the faint scent of salt and pine. Somewhere out there, the tide kept rising and falling, erasing what it needed to and leaving what was meant to stay. And in that quiet rhythm, our lives finally began to move forward again. The first winter after his death came quietly without the heavy storms the coast usually carried. The days felt slower, the light softer, and for the first time in years, our lives moved without the constant echo of his name. My mother filled the studio with color again, deep greens, bright ochres, warm golds that looked like sunlight captured on canvas. I handled most of the business work, new clients exhibitions, gallery coordination. Together, we turned Elaine and Nora Designs into something more than a studio. It became a place where people found a kind of calm, a safe corner of the world that didn't ask questions about what came before. One cold afternoon in February, I came back from town to find a note on the kitchen table. Out painting by the cliffs. Back before dark. I smiled, poured myself coffee, and opened my laptop to finish a few design revisions. When the light began to fade and she hadn't returned, I felt a small pinch of worry. The ocean had a way of keeping time differently. Minutes could stretch into hours without you noticing. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the cliffs. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with low silver clouds. I followed the narrow path down to the bluff, where she often painted. Her easel stood near the edge, a canvas, half-finished brush, resting in the sand beside it. But she wasn't there. Panic rose, quick and sharp. I called her name, my voice lost to the wind. Then, from the rocks below, I heard a faint sound, not quite a cry, but enough. I scrambled down the slope, careful not to slip. She was there sitting near the waterline, one leg twisted awkwardly beneath her, her face pale but calm. "Nora," she said softly when she saw me. I slipped. I knelt beside her, my heart pounding. "Don't move. Let me call for help." She caught my arm. "It's not as bad as it looks." But it was. The angle of her leg told me that much. I called 911. My voice barely steady as I explained where we were. The paramedics arrived faster than I expected. They lifted her carefully, wrapping her in blankets, and one of them said, "She's lucky you found her this fast. The tide's rising." At the hospital, they confirmed a clean fracture and mild hypothermia. She'd need surgery, but she'd recover fully. While they prepped her, I sat in the waiting area, watching the rain hit the windows in slow streaks. The same nurse who had once whispered to me in the hospital years ago, Miriam, appeared at my side. I hadn't seen her in months. "She'll be fine," she said gently, strong as ever. When I went to see my mother later, she was drowsy but smiling. "You found me," she whispered. I took her hand. "Of course I did." She squeezed it lightly. "That cliff. I was painting the horizon. Thought I saw something out there, something bright, like light under the water." She paused, eyes half closed. Maybe it was just the sun. Maybe not. She recovered slowly over the next few weeks, confined to the couch at home. I moved my work into the living room so I could be nearby. She'd nap through most afternoons, the soft hum of the ocean outside, blending with the scratch of my pencil across sketch paper. One evening, as we watched the sky turn violet over the sea, she said, "You know, I think that fall was the universe reminding me to stop running. I've spent so long surviving that I forgot how to rest." I didn't argue. She had a way of finding lessons in things without forcing them. By spring, she was walking again with a cane, slower but steady. We reopened the studio together. The first show we hosted was called Pieces of Light. It featured her new coastal paintings alongside some of my design work. People filled the room that opening night, voices warm with admiration. A man from Portland's art museum approached us near the end. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, "your work deserves a wider audience. We'd love to feature you in our summer exhibit." She looked at me, then back at him. "Only if my daughter's work comes too." That summer became a blur of travel and gallery shows. We visited small towns up the coast, each one offering something new, a mural commission here, a charity auction there. For the first time, we were seen not as a tragedy, but as creators. The shadow of the past no longer led every introduction. One night in June, we were invited to a private dinner after a showing in Newport. The evening was filled with laughter glasses, clinking music soft in the background. My mother leaned over halfway through and said, "Do you realize we've made it through a whole evening without anyone saying his name?" I smiled. I hadn't noticed. She reached for my hand across the table. "Then maybe it's time to stop carrying it entirely." The next morning I woke early and walked down to the beach before sunrise. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath my feet. I thought about how far we'd come, the hospital nights, the fear, the quiet rebuilding, and how the weight of grief had shifted over time. I didn't know what the next chapter of our lives would hold, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It felt open, full of possibility. In late August, a letter arrived from the Portland Art Museum. They wanted to purchase 2 of my mother's paintings for their permanent collection and commission a joint exhibition of our work the following spring. When I told her, she laughed softly. From hiding to hanging on a museum wall. Life's funny, isn't it? That evening we sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with gold and rose the same colors she loved to paint. "You know," she said, "after a while, for years, I thought justice meant punishment. Now I see it's something quieter. It's getting to live without fear." Her words lingered in the air, the sound of the sea folding around them like a promise. As the last light faded, she reached for my hand again. "Whatever comes next, Nora, keep choosing peace, not the kind that hides from the world, the kind that builds it." The wind carried her words out toward the ocean, and I watched as a single gull swept low across the waves, vanishing into the horizon. Somewhere in that moment, I realized we weren't just survivors anymore. We were builders of art, of freedom, of the kind of life that comes after the storm. When we went inside, I noticed her latest canvas on the easel. It was unfinished, but the outline was clear, a small cottage by the sea light spilling from the windows, and 2 figures standing on the porch beneath a sky that was finally clear. The next morning I found her already painting again, her brush moving slow but steady. The scent of coffee filled the room. "New piece?" I asked. She smiled without looking up. "The last one in the series," she said. "Then it's yours to finish." Outside, the ocean shimmered under the first light of day. I stood beside her, watching the colors come to life, and realized that in every shade she painted, there was a little more peace, a little more forgiveness. And though we both knew the past would always live somewhere inside us, it no longer defined what came next. The waves rolled gently against the shore, the same steady rhythm that had carried us through everything. I looked at her and saw not the woman who'd faked her death to survive, but the one who'd learned how to live again. And in that quiet, I knew our story wasn't ending. It was simply turning into light. The following spring arrived softer than any before it. The air along the coast carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and the gulls moved lazily across a pale sky that never seemed in a hurry to fade. Inside our studio, the sunlight spread across the floor like gold dust catching on the edges of half-finished canvases. My mother sat near the window, the last strokes of her brush steady and sure. She was finishing the painting she had started that morning, a bright horizon over calm water. 2 figures standing on the porch of a small house by the sea. She looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years, as if time had finally loosened its grip. When she set her brush down, she leaned back with a quiet smile. "There," she said. "It's done." I walked over to stand behind her. The painting glowed in the light, the waves shimmering with hints of rose and gold. "It looks alive," I told her. She nodded slowly. "It is. It's everything we lived for." That summer, the Portland Art Museum held our joint exhibition. The opening night was filled with people, some who knew our story, most who didn't. They wandered through the gallery in gentle silence, stopping in front of each piece. My mother's work filled one side of the room, mine, the other the 2 blending somewhere in the middle, like they'd always been meant to meet there. When she stepped up to give her short speech, her voice was calm but strong. "Art," she said, "was my way back to life. And sometimes when life breaks you, creation is how you mend." The room went still. When she finished, there wasn't applause right away, just a quiet collective breath before the sound swelled. Later that night, after the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, we stood together in front of the largest painting in the collection. It was hers, The Long Night, the one she had painted after the trial, showing a storm breaking apart over the ocean. The colors seemed to move even in stillness. She touched my arm and whispered, You know, Nora, this isn't about what we lost. It's about what we refuse to let die inside us. After the exhibition, we returned home to the cottage. Life settled into a gentle rhythm again. The studio stayed busy, but quieter, less about deadlines, more about joy. My mother's students came and went, their laughter filling the rooms. I took on design projects that felt meaningful, things that built rather than sold. Sometimes in the evenings, we'd sit on the porch in the glow of the lantern light, listening to the waves roll in. She'd hum the same tune she used to paint to, and I'd find myself thinking how strange it was that peace could arrive after so much chaos, not as a gift, but as something earned. One night in late September, I found her sketchbook open on the table. On the last page, she had written a few lines in her looping handwriting. "If truth is a storm, then love is the light that follows it." I closed the book carefully and looked toward her studio door, where the soft glow of her lamp spilled onto the floor. That line stayed with me, not because it sounded poetic, but because it felt true. Everything we'd been through, all the loss, fear, and rebuilding, had led to this kind of quiet truth. A few months later, her health began to falter. It wasn't sudden. It was the slow, natural decline of someone who had lived fully and without regret. We didn't speak of fear. We spoke of mornings still to come, of the garden she wanted to plant when spring returned, of the children she taught, who reminded her that kindness was a kind of art. She passed one morning in her sleep with the window open and the sea breeze moving through the curtains. After the service, I returned home and sat on the porch alone for the first time. The horizon was pale blue, the same color she loved to use in her paintings. The cottage felt both emptier and fuller at once, holding every memory we'd ever made. I looked out toward the sea and felt no bitterness, just the steady rhythm of waves carrying everything forward like they always had. I still run the studio. I still paint, though. I think she'd laugh at how often I start and stop. The sign out front still reads, Elaine and Nora Designs, and every spring I host a small show for local artists. Sometimes people ask about the name, and I tell them it belonged to a mother and daughter who believed in second chances. What I don't say, though, I think it every time, is that she was the second chance for herself and for me. When I stand by the shore these days, the world feels quiet but alive. The ocean glimmers the same way it did that first night she came back to me, and the wind carries her voice like a memory that never fades. I've learned that justice isn't only about punishment, it's about truth finding its way home and about choosing peace after everything else has burned away. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand a little of what that means. Maybe you've weathered storms of your own or carried a story that deserved to end differently. I hope ours reminds you that even after betrayal and loss, it's still possible to rebuild your life from the pieces, and that sometimes survival itself is the quietest kind of victory. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to share it or simply sit with it, because the most beautiful things we build, the ones that last, often begin the moment we stop running from the past and decide to live again.